Sally's roadside diner sat on Highway 40 like a monument to American tradition. Morning sunlight streamed through windows that had witnessed 4 decades of truckers, travelers, and locals gathering over coffee and honest food. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee mingled with the subtle perfume of nostalgia. Red-checkered tablecloths and chrome stools gleamed under fluorescent lights that had illuminated countless conversations, business deals, and morning revelations. This Saturday morning carried the comfortable rhythm Sally had cultivated since taking over the place in 1973. The regular symphony of clinking plates and murmured conversations filled the air. The breakfast rush had begun to thin, leaving behind a pleasant buzz of activity and the occasional burst of laughter from the counter where 3 truck drivers exchanged stories from the road. In the back corner booth, 8 members of the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club sat surrounded by empty plates and coffee mugs in various states of fullness. Their leather vests bore patches telling stories of rallies, rides, and brotherhood. Road dust from their morning ride still clung to their boots. These men were fixtures at Sally's, having claimed this particular booth every Saturday morning for 15 years without incident. Mason Cole, the club's sergeant-at-arms, savored his last bite of pancakes. At 55, his weathered face told stories of highways crossed and storms weathered, deep crow's feet framed eyes that had seen more of life than most. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his hands wrapped around a coffee mug bore the calluses of a man who understood the value of work. The Harley-Davidson electric glide parked outside gleamed with the meticulous care of someone who respected machinery. Beside him, Bull, the president of the Iron Brotherhood, discussed plans for their upcoming charity ride benefiting the Children's Hospital. A veteran with a booming laugh that belied his imposing frame, Bull had founded the club 20 years ago with a simple code ride, "Our respect, all protect the vulnerable." The other 6 members represented a cross-section of American life: a mechanic, a retired school teacher, a construction worker, 2 factory employees, and a truck driver. Their Saturday breakfasts were sacrosanct, a ritual of camaraderie before the responsibilities of the weekend took hold. The peaceful morning cadence shattered at precisely 9:32 a.m. The diner's bell erupted with violent force as the door flew open, banging against the wall with such intensity that the glass nearly shattered. Conversation died instantly, every head turned toward the unexpected intrusion. A small figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sunlight. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing what had once been a red dress, now torn and soiled. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and tears. Most shocking were her bare feet, bloodied from running across the gravel parking lot. She stood there, chest-heaving, wild-eyed with desperation. For 3 heartbeats, the diner remained frozen in collective shock. Then the girl's voice broke the stillness, a desperate shriek that sliced through the air. "Please help. They're beating my mama." The plea echoed in the suddenly silent diner. Customers stared uncertain, scared. Some reached for phones. Others simply watched, paralyzed by the unexpected drama unfolding before their morning coffee had fully taken effect. Mason placed his fork down with deliberate care. His eyes met those of Bull across the table. A single nod passed between them, laden with decades of shared understanding. 8 bikers stood as one, leather creaking and boots thudding against linoleum. Hannah, the little girl, stood trembling in the doorway, her small body consumed by terror and desperate hope. Through tears and gasping breath, she scanned the diner for anyone who might help. Her young mind raced with pure animal panic. When bad men hurt Mom in the parking lot and nobody stops them, you run to the biggest, scariest people you can find, because maybe scary means strong enough to make it stop. She had spotted the motorcycles through the diner window, remembered her mother once saying bikers sometimes help people, and made a choice born of desperation: trust strangers or watch her mother die. As the bikers rose, other customers shrank back instinctively. Bikers had reputations: violence, danger, trouble. Parents pulled children closer. An elderly couple near the door edged toward the exit. Hannah hesitated only a moment before running straight to Mason, grabbing his leather vest with small, desperate hands. "Please, mister," she begged, tears streaming down her dirty face. "He's killing her out there." Her tiny finger pointed toward the parking lot. "Mama's ex-boyfriend. He found us. Please." Mason looked down into eyes wide with terror and trust. Those eyes transported him instantly to memories of children he'd encountered throughout his life who needed protection. In that moment of connection, time compressed. Decades of seeing the vulnerable preyed upon by the strong crystallized into a singular clarity of purpose. He looked at his brothers. No words needed. They had taken an oath when joining the Iron Brotherhood: protect the innocent, especially children. The code was simple and immutable. "Show us," Mason said, already moving toward the door, the girl's small hand still clutching his vest like a lifeline. The 8 bikers moved with surprising grace and coordination, a formation born of years riding together through mountain passes and crowded highways. They flowed toward the exit, Bull leading Mason, guiding the child, the others forming a protective phalanx around them. Sally, who had known these men for 15 years, watched them go without a word. She had already picked up the phone to call 911, but something in her expression conveyed absolute confidence in what was about to happen. These weren't the troublemakers people assumed them to be. These were men who understood responsibility. The morning air outside felt electric with tension. The parking lot of Sally's Diner spread before them a dozen vehicles baking in the early sun. In the far corner, partially obscured between two pickup trucks, motion caught their attention immediately. The scene they discovered burned itself instantly into their collective memory. Carla Matthews, 32, lay half-sprawled against a car fender as a man twice her size towered over her. Derek Walsh, her ex-boyfriend, rained blows down with methodical cruelty, while Carla tried desperately to shield herself with bloodied arms. Too weak to fight back, too isolated to escape her face already swollen beyond recognition. "Derek, stop!" Hannah screamed from behind the protective wall of bikers. Walsh looked up momentarily startled. 6'3" and built like a heavyweight boxer gone to seed, his face flushed with exertion and rage. Stubble covered a jaw clenched in anger. His knuckles were split and bleeding from the beating he'd been administering. He took in the sight of 8 leather-clad men approaching and sneered. "Mind your own business," he spat. "This is between me and my woman." Mason stepped forward, his voice deadly calm. "She's not your woman," he said, positioning himself between Derek and Carla. "And you just made it our business when our kid came crying for help." His words carried no bluster, no theatrical threat. Just the simple statement of fact delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who had stood his ground many times before. Derek sized up the situation. 8 bikers, all of them weathered solid. None appeared intimidated by his size advantage. His alcohol-addled mind calculated odds and found them wanting. "You bikers think you're tough," he snarled, puffing his chest. "I'll take all 8 of—" Mason didn't let him finish. One punch, clean, precise. Decades of bar fights and self-defense distilled into a single economical movement. His fist connected with Derek's jaw with the perfect combination of leverage, momentum, and restraint. Derek dropped like a sack of concrete. Not unconscious, but thoroughly dazed, sprawled in an ungainly heap beside the car where moments before he had been the aggressor. The other bikers moved with practiced efficiency. 2 helped Carla to her feet, supporting her weight with gentle hands that belied their rough appearance. 1 called 911, calmly giving their location and situation. 3 secured Derek, who was conscious but disoriented, keeping him down without unnecessary force. Mason knelt to Hannah's level, his weathered face softening. "You okay, kid?" Hannah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Is Mama okay?" "She's hurt, but she's alive," Mason said, his gravelly voice gentle. "You saved her. You know that. You were brave enough to ask for help. That's real courage." The child's eyes widened slightly at this, a tiny flicker of pride momentarily displacing terror. Bull approached his imposing frame, blocking the morning sun. "Sheriff's 8 minutes out. Ambulance, too." He looked at Carla, then at the girl, his expression softening. "Kid's got guts. Ran straight to us without hesitation. Smart, too." Mason nodded. Knew exactly who could handle this situation. First aid began immediately. The bikers were surprisingly adept, their skills honed through decades of road accidents and mishaps. They used napkins from the diner as makeshift bandages. 2 leather jackets became a pillow and a blanket for Carla. Carla remained conscious, but barely. Black eyes, swelling lips, split ribs, likely cracked from kicks. Through her one good eye, she looked at the men helping her with confusion and gratitude. "Hannah," she gasped. "Where's Hannah?" "Right here, Mama," Hannah said, holding her mother's hand. "The bikers stopped him. You're safe." Carla looked at Mason through her swollen eye. "Thank you," she whispered. "He would have killed me if you hadn't—" "Don't think about that," Mason said firmly. "Think about staying awake until the ambulance gets here." Bull knelt beside them, his deep voice steady. "Ma'am, I'm Bull, president of the Iron Brotherhood. This is Mason, our sergeant-at-arms. The others are Preacher, Doc, Tank, Hammer, Rivet, and Sparky. You're safe now. We're not leaving until you're in good hands." Carla nodded slightly, wincing with pain. Doc, a former military medic before becoming a high school shop teacher, monitored her closely. Possible concussion, definite broken ribs. She needs a hospital, but she's stable. Derek began stirring more coherently, muttering threats. Hammer and Rivet kept him secured, their expressions impassive but vigilant. At 9:42 a.m., sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived with lights flashing, followed closely by an ambulance. The sheriff exited his vehicle, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Unlike many law enforcement officers who might approach a group of bikers with suspicion, Bradley nodded in recognition. The Iron Brotherhood had done charity rides with the department, helped with toy drives, never caused trouble in his jurisdiction. They were known entities, respected if not fully understood. "Mason," Bradley greeted, surveying the scene. "What happened here?" "Little girl ran into Sally's crying for help." Mason explained, his voice matter of fact. "We found her mama being beaten in the parking lot, restrained the attacker. He's over there." Bradley looked toward Derek, now sitting on the curb, handcuffed by a deputy who had arrived seconds after the sheriff. Recognition dawned on Bradley's face. "Derek Walsh," he said, his voice hardening. "We've had multiple restraining order violations on file. Carla Matthews pressed charges twice. He keeps finding her." "Not anymore," Mason said quietly. "This time there are 8 witnesses and assault charges that'll stick." Paramedics worked efficiently, loading Carla onto a stretcher. Her face was already swelling dramatically, breathing labored from the rib injuries. Hannah climbed in beside her, refusing to let go of her mother's hand. As the ambulance doors prepared to close, Hannah looked back at Mason, her small voice barely audible over the idling engine. "Will you come check on us?" she asked, uncertainty and hope mingling in her expression. Mason nodded solemnly, as binding as any contract. "Promise, kid. We'll make sure you're both safe." The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, sirens silent but lights flashing as it navigated the parking lot and turned toward the county hospital. Sheriff Bradley approached Mason as his deputies secured Derek in a patrol car. "You know," he said conversationally, "most folks would have called 911 and stayed inside." "We're not most folks," Mason replied simply. "No," Bradley agreed. "You're not, and thank God for that, or we might be looking at a homicide scene instead of an assault." He sighed heavily. "Between you and me, the system fails women like Carla. Restraining orders are just paper. By the time we respond to a violation, it's often too late." "That's why the girl ran to us instead of waiting for a phone call," Bull interjected. "Kids understand power dynamics better than we give them credit for." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need statements from all of you, and I'm guessing you'll be available if this goes to trial." 8 bikers nodded as one. "Good," Bradley said, "because this time Walsh isn't walking away with a warning or overnight lockup. With your testimony and multiple priors, he's looking at serious time." That evening, Mason and 2 brothers Doc and Preacher visited the hospital. They found room 317, easily following a nurse's directions. Through the half-open door they observed Carla, in a hospital bed, Hannah curled beside her on the narrow mattress, both asleep. The first rest either had gotten in months free from fear for the first time. A nurse approached quietly, her name tag identifying her as Jennifer. She studied the 3 bikers with interest rather than apprehension. "You the bikers who saved her?" she asked softly. "We helped," Mason said, uncomfortable with hero labels. Jennifer's expression grew serious. "She told me everything when she woke earlier. That monster had been hunting her for 3 months. She had moved towns twice, changed jobs. He kept finding her." Her voice hardened. "If that little girl hadn't found you—" "She did," Mason said simply. "That's what matters." They waited quietly until Carla stirred awake. Her one unbandaged eye widened in surprise, then filled with tears. Not from pain, but relief at seeing them there, proof that the morning's rescue hadn't been a fever dream born of desperation. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered hoarsely. "We have nothing. I'm broke from running. I don't even know where we'll go after this. He knows every shelter, every friend we might turn to." Mason exchanged glances with Doc and Preacher. A silent communication passed between them, forged through decades of friendship and shared values. "We'll figure something out," Mason promised. "Nobody's going to hurt you or Hannah again." The words hung in the air, a covenant made by men who understood the weight of promises. Men who recognized that sometimes protection meant more than a single intervention. Sometimes it meant standing guard until danger fully passed. The next evening, the Iron Brotherhood called an emergency meeting. 20 riders showed up at their clubhouse, a converted warehouse they'd purchased and renovated over the years. Word had spread about the parking lot rescue. The atmosphere was charged with purpose as they gathered around the long oak table that had witnessed countless club decisions. Mason stood before his brothers, his expression grave. "Carla Matthews and her daughter need protection," he explained. "Ex-boyfriend's in jail now, but he'll make bail eventually. She's got no money, no safe place, no support system." "What are you proposing?" asked Bull, the club president. "Club protection," Mason replied without hesitation. "We put her up somewhere safe, provide security, help her get back on her feet." Murmurs spread through the group. One member, Diesel, voiced the question others were thinking. "We're not a charity, Mason. We got our own families to worry about." The room quieted, waiting for Mason's response. "That little girl ran to us for help," Mason said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Chose us when she had nothing. We answered. Can't walk away now." The simplicity of his argument resonated through the room. The code was clear: protect the vulnerable, especially children and women fleeing abuse. It was written on the wall behind them, carved into wood, along with their other founding principles. Bull considered the situation, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he nodded once decisively. "Motion passes. Mason, your point on this. Figure out logistics." No formal vote was needed. The nods around the table confirmed unanimous support. The Iron Brotherhood had just adopted a mission that would change not only Carla and Hannah's lives, but their own as well. The next morning, Mason visited the hospital with news. He found Carla, sitting up in bed looking marginally better despite the colorful bruising covering much of her face. Hannah sat in a chair beside the bed, coloring intently in a book one of the nurses had provided. "Morning," Mason greeted, setting down a paper bag containing breakfast sandwiches from Sally's diner. "Brought you something better than hospital food." Hannah looked up, her face brightening. "Mr. Mason!" She scrambled from her chair and wrapped her arms around his waist in an unexpected hug. Mason froze momentarily, then awkwardly patted her back, unaccustomed to such displays of affection. Yet something in his expression softened as he looked down at the child who had trusted him with her mother's life. "The club had a meeting," he told Carla, once Hannah had returned to her coloring. "We've got a place for you both. Small apartment above a bookstore owned by the sister of one of our members. It's furnished secure and comes with round-the-clock protection until we're sure Walsh isn't a threat." Carla stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us." Mason considered her question carefully. "Because your daughter asked for help," he said finally, "and because sometimes the world needs reminding that not everyone looks away." Tears welled in Carla's eyes. "I can't pay you, not yet anyway." "Not asking for payment," Mason replied. "Brotherhood has a code. Protecting people like you and Hannah is part of it." Hannah looked up from her coloring book. "Are we going to live with the bikers, Mama?" Her voice carried excitement rather than fear. Mason smiled slightly. "Not exactly, kid, but we'll be around." 3 days later, Carla was released from the hospital. 4 Iron Brotherhood members escorted the Matthews family to their new temporary home. The apartment was small but comfortable, situated above Turning Pages, a bookstore in a quiet part of town. Security cameras had been installed at every entry point. The fire escape had been reinforced. A security system linked directly to both the sheriff's department and the Iron Brotherhood clubhouse. "It's not the Ritz," Bull explained as he showed them around, "but it's safe." Hannah explored the space with growing excitement. Her bedroom had been hastily but thoughtfully furnished with a bed dresser and small desk. On the wall hung a framed photo of a motorcycle against a sunset. "Is this yours?" she asked Mason, pointing to the picture. "No, kid. That's a knucklehead from 1947, way before my time," he replied. "But it's a classic. Thought you might like it since you seem interested in bikes." Hannah nodded solemnly. "I'm going to have one when I grow up." Carla smiled for the first time since the attack. "One thing at a time, honey." As the brothers prepared to leave, Mason provided Carla with a prepaid cell phone. "Speed dial 1 is the sheriff, 2 is me, 3 is Bull. Someone will always answer day or night." Carla clutched the phone like a lifeline. "I don't know how we'll ever repay this kindness." "You don't," Bull said firmly. "That's what makes it kindness." As days turned into weeks, a routine developed. 2 Iron Brotherhood members maintained watch on the apartment building at all times, rotating shifts. Hannah returned to school and rolled under a slight variation of her name as a precaution. Carla began working part-time at Sally's diner once her injuries healed enough. The rescue made local news. "Bikers save woman from brutal assault" ran in the county paper and local TV stations. The diner's security footage showing Hannah running in desperate and barefoot touched hearts across 3 counties. Donations poured in, clothing for Hannah, gift cards for groceries, even offers of legal assistance from attorneys moved by their story. The Iron Brotherhood found themselves cast in an unfamiliar light, heroes rather than outlaws. They accepted the attention with characteristic stoicism, deflecting praise with the same determination they once deflected suspicion. For Hannah, the bikers became extended family. She did homework at the diner after school, often with 1 or 2 Brotherhood members nearby. They helped her with math problems, told cleaned-up road stories, taught her about motorcycles in age-appropriate ways. Her nightmares gradually subsided, replaced by a growing confidence nurtured by the protective presence of men who had answered when she called. One evening, a month after the rescue, Mason found Hannah sitting alone outside the diner, clutching a piece of paper. "What you got there, kid?" he asked, sitting beside her on the bench. Hannah wordlessly handed him a crayon drawing. It showed 8 stick figures wearing black standing protectively around a woman and child. Above them, in careful letters, she had written, "My heroes wear leather." Mason studied the drawing, something catching in his throat. "This is really good," he said finally. "It's for your clubhouse," Hannah explained, "so everyone remembers." Mason carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into his vest pocket. "I'll make sure it gets framed proper," he promised. That night at the Iron Brotherhood clubhouse, Mason shared the drawing with his brothers. They studied it in uncharacteristic silence, these rough men who had traveled countless highways and weathered life's hardest storms. "Guess we're in the hero business now," Bull said finally, his gruff voice betraying emotion he'd never openly acknowledge. Mason nodded. "Guess we are." The drawing was framed and hung prominently on the wall of the clubhouse opposite their code. A reminder that sometimes the most important journeys didn't involve motorcycles at all, but rather the courage to stop when someone needed help. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a new normal for Carla and Hannah. Derek Walsh remained in jail denied bail due to the severity of the assault and his history of violating restraining orders. The district attorney promised Mason that this time the charges would stick. Carla flourished at Sally's diner, her natural warmth and resilience earning her a promotion to assistant manager. Hannah excelled in school, particularly in art, often creating pieces about the day the bikers saved us. The Iron Brotherhood maintained their protective watch, though, with decreasing intensity as the immediate danger seemed to pass. Then, 67 days after the rescue, Sheriff Bradley called Mason at 11 p.m. The night had grown cold, a hint of autumn in the air as Mason answered his phone. "Derek's back," Bradley said without preamble. "Spotted at a gas station 10 miles from Carla's apartment. His lawyer got the charges reduced, paid bail 2 hours ago. We're trying to locate him, but he's off-grid. No phone, no credit cards, nothing to track." Mason's blood ran cold. "He's coming for them." "We'll patrol her building," Bradley offered. "Not enough," Mason replied, already reaching for his keys. "He's had 2 months to plan this. He won't be deterred by occasional drive-bys." Mason hung up immediately, triggering the Brotherhood's emergency protocol. 20 bikes roared through the night within 30 minutes, converging on Carla's apartment building from all directions, headlights cutting through darkness like avenging angels. They found Carla and Hannah safe for now, but terrified after Bradley's warning call. "He won't stop," Carla said, her voice shaking as she packed essentials. "He told me once if he couldn't have me, nobody could. He meant it." Hannah clung to her mother, the brave little girl from the diner, reduced to a trembling child by the return of her nightmare. When she saw Mason, however, her shoulders straightened slightly. "You promised we'd be safe," she said, not as accusation, but as reminder. "And you will be," Mason replied, his voice certain. The Iron Brotherhood established a defensive perimeter within minutes. 4 bikers stationed themselves outside Carla's apartment door. 4 more patrolled the parking lot. The rest circled the neighborhood in shift's eyes, scanning for Derek's vehicle, a black Ford F-150 with Montana plates. The night stretched on tense with anticipation. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Inside the apartment, Carla had finally convinced Hannah to sleep the child's exhaustion, eventually overcoming her fear. Mason sat at the kitchen table with Bull planning contingencies in hushed voices. "If he shows we need to handle this permanent," Bull muttered. "Legal, but permanent." "Agreed." Mason nodded. "Bradley wants him back behind bars where he belongs." At precisely 2:37 a.m., the radio clip to Mason's belt crackled to life. "Target spotted," came Hammer's voice, tight with tension. "Black F-150 moving toward the building. Lights off." Mason and Bull exchanged glances, then moved with silent efficiency. Mason spoke softly into his radio. "All units positions. He approaches from the south. Remember, we contain and call Bradley. No exceptions." The Brotherhood members shifted into their predetermined positions. 4 guarding the building entrance, 4 securing the parking lot exits, the rest closing in on Derek's location. A net tightening around a predator who had finally found his prey. Derek parked 2 blocks away, approaching on foot through shadows. As he drew closer, the moonlight revealed what he carried: a crowbar in one hand, a plastic container in the other. Mason focused his night-adapted eyes and felt his stomach clench. Gasoline. Derek Walsh wasn't just coming to confront Carla. He intended to force entry and burn the building with them inside. The implications crystallized Mason's resolve. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This was prevention of attempted murder. Mason stepped from the shadows directly into Derek's path, with 7 brothers positioned behind him. "Derek Walsh," he said, his voice carrying in the night stillness. "Stop right there!" Derek froze, momentarily startled by the ambush. Then his face contorted with hatred. "You again!" he spat. "This isn't your business." "We made it our business," Mason replied calmly. "And you just showed up with gasoline and a crowbar outside her building. That's attempted arson, attempted murder, multiple felonies." Derek's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You can't be here all the time," he said finally. "I'll wait. I'm patient." "You're not waiting anywhere," Mason stated flatly. The finality in his tone made clear this confrontation would conclude tonight one way or another. "What you'll beat me up, call the cops," Derek sneered. "I've been beaten. I've been arrested. Doesn't matter. She's mine." "She was never yours," Mason corrected. "And now you're caught red-handed, planning something that will put you away for decades." Derek tensed, preparing to charge or flee when headlights swept across the scene. Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up, followed by 2 deputies. Mason had called him the moment Derek was spotted. "Drop the crowbar in the gas," Bradley ordered, weapon drawn. Derek looked around, evaluating his options. 8 bikers, 4 law enforcement officers, no escape. He dropped both items, but his eyes promised violence. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Mason said quietly. "It is." The arrest proceeded without incident. Derek Walsh was handcuffed and read his rights, charged with stalking, attempted arson, violation of restraining orders, and possession of weapons with intent to harm. This time there would be no bail. This time the judge, a woman who had survived domestic violence herself, would throw the book at him. 10 years minimum federal prison out of state, no early release. When Mason told Carla the news the next morning, she collapsed in relief, months of tension draining from her body like a physical weight lifted. Hannah, understanding what it meant, asked one question. Is the bad man gone forever? Mason considered his words carefully. The girl deserved honesty, but also peace of mind. Not forever, he said finally, but for a very, very long time. Long enough for you to grow up safe. Hannah nodded, accepting this answer with the gravity of a child who had learned too young that adults sometimes lie to protect feelings. Thank you for keeping your promise, she said simply. With Derek permanently removed from their lives, Carla and Hannah began truly healing, not just from physical wounds, but from years of psychological torture. Carla attended therapy provided by a nonprofit the Brotherhood supported. Hannah joined a support group for children who had witnessed domestic violence. Both slowly learned to breathe without fear shadowing every moment. The Iron Brotherhood didn't hover. They checked in weekly, provided security when needed, but gave space for Carla and Hannah to rebuild independence. This wasn't about creating dependency. It was about providing safety until they could stand confidently on their own. Sally's Diner became a second home for Carla and Hannah. The regulars, truckers, locals, even the bikers treated them like family. Tips were generous. Conversations were kind. Nobody judged the journey that had brought them there. Hannah would do homework in the back booth while Carla worked shifts. The Brotherhood members would stop by regularly, becoming fixtures in her young life. One Saturday afternoon, Hannah looked up from her math homework to ask Mason a question that had clearly been on her mind. Can girls be bikers too? Mason's weathered face broke into a rare smile. Absolutely, he said. Some of the toughest riders I know are women. Hannah's eyes lit up, a future taking shape in her imagination. When I grow up, I want to be a biker who helps people like you. Mason felt something stir in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose that transcended leather and engines and brotherhood. He'd saved a life, sure, but more than that, he'd given a kid hope that heroes existed in a world that often seemed devoid of them. 6 months after the parking lot rescue, the Iron Brotherhood organized a fundraiser ride proceeds, going to domestic violence shelters and legal aid for survivors. 500 riders showed up from 3 states, creating a thunderous parade through town that raised $75,000. At the ceremony afterward, Carla spoke publicly for the first time, her voice steady despite the emotion that evident in her eyes. 6 months ago, my daughter ran into a diner begging strangers for help, she began. Those strangers, these bikers, didn't hesitate. They saved my life. They protected my daughter. They gave us a chance to rebuild. She looked at Mason standing with his brothers, her gaze direct and unflinching. People see leather and assume danger, but I see leather and remember the day danger wore a familiar face and strangers in leather became my salvation. Hannah stepped forward, then holding a large framed canvas. It was an updated version of her earlier crayon art, now painted with care and detail. It showed 8 bikers surrounding a woman in child shields against darkness with text reading, "Sometimes heroes ride Harleys." She presented it to Mason for the clubhouse. "So everyone remembers," she explained, echoing her words from months earlier. The crowd erupted in applause. Biker survivors, community members united in recognition of something powerful and true. Mason knelt accepting the gift, then pulled Hannah into a hug. "You were the hero, kid," he said quietly for her ears alone. "You ran for help when it mattered most. That's courage." Hannah beamed with pride, standing straight, her shoulders back. In that moment, Mason saw the woman she would become someday, strong, brave, unbroken by the darkness she had witnessed. 1 year after that fateful morning at Sally's Diner, the transformation was complete. Carla had become a domestic violence advocate, working with the same nonprofits the Brotherhood supported. Hannah thrived in school, excelling in art and writing, often creating pieces about the day the bikers saved us. The Iron Brotherhood expanded their community protection program, partnering with shelters providing escorts for women fleeing abuse, teaching self-defense classes. What had begun as one desperate child running into a diner had evolved into a mission that defined their club far more than motorcycles ever could. On the anniversary of the diner rescue, Sally hosted a celebration. Carla, Hannah, the Brotherhood, Sheriff Bradley, and dozens of community members gathered not to celebrate violence, but to celebrate the power of answering a cry for help. Hannah, now 8, stood at the microphone, her voice clear and confident. "A year ago, I was scared. I ran into this diner crying. I didn't know if anyone would help, but Mr. Mason and his friends did. They taught me that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up when you need them." She looked directly at Mason, her eyes shining. "Thank you for showing up." Sometimes the bravest cry for help interrupts the quietest morning. And what begins as breakfast among strangers ends as a rescue that transforms lives, proving that heroes answer calls they never expected to receive. Hannah's drawing hung prominently in the Iron Brotherhood clubhouse, reminding all who entered that their mission extended beyond rides and brotherhood to protecting the vulnerable. The club's domestic violence protection program became a model nationwide, partnering with law enforcement and nonprofits to create safe corridors for survivors escaping abuse. Mason became an unlikely advocate speaking at community events about bystander intervention and breaking stereotypes. His message was simple: we're all capable of being heroes. You just have to answer when someone asks for help. Carla rebuilt her life completely. New career in victim advocacy. Safe home. Thriving daughter. Derek remained in federal prison, his appeal denied, a threat neutralized permanently. At Hannah's high school graduation years later, Mason sat in the front row beside Carla. Hannah's valedictorian speech concluded with words that brought tears to even the most hardened bikers present. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather and answer when a little girl in a red dress asks them to save her mama. The photograph from that morning, Hannah running into Sally's diner, became an iconic image of community courage and unexpected heroism. It hung in Sheriff Bradley's office in the county courthouse and in Mason's home, a reminder that the most important journeys often begin when we choose to stop for someone in need. Defenders, when bikers become heroes. Act Part 2. The Brotherhood expands. 5 years after the rescue at Sally's Diner, the Iron Brotherhood's mission had evolved far beyond what any of them had imagined that fateful Saturday morning. What began as 8 men stepping up to help a desperate child had blossomed into a structured network spanning 3 states. Their Defenders program had become a recognized force in combating domestic violence, providing safe transport, secure housing, and ongoing protection for families fleeing abuse. Mason Cole, now 60, stood before a gathering of 30 prospective volunteers in the expanded meeting room of the Iron Brotherhood clubhouse. Gray dominated his once salt and pepper beard, and then the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his presence commanded the same quiet authority it always had. "The work we do isn't glamorous," he explained, his gravelly voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's not about glory or recognition, it's about being there when someone has nowhere else to turn." He surveyed the faces before him, a mix of veteran bikers and community members who'd never straddled a motorcycle in their lives. Some nights you'll sit outside an apartment building until dawn. Some days you'll escort someone to court to face their abuser. You'll install security systems, drive folks to medical appointments, help kids feel safe again. He paused, letting his words settle. If you're looking for excitement, there are better ways to find it. If you're looking for purpose, there's nothing more important than what we do here. At the back of the room, Hannah Matthews, now 12 years old, listened intently. She wore jeans and a leather vest that Bull had custom-made for her last birthday. Honorary member was embroidered across the back alongside an image of a guardian angel riding a motorcycle. Her mother, Carla, now the Brotherhood's official program coordinator, stood beside her clipboard in hand taking notes. The transformation in both of them over 5 years was remarkable. Gone was the haunted look that had lingered in Carla's eyes for months after the attack. In its place shone purpose and confidence. She had earned an associate's degree in social work and built the administrative backbone of the program that had once saved her life. Hannah had blossomed from a traumatized child into a self-assured preteen with a fierce protective streak. She had become the unofficial mascot of the Iron Brotherhood, a bridge between the intimidating bikers and the frightened children they sought to help. She possessed an uncanny ability to connect with kids who'd witnessed violence, offering them a living example of healing and growth. Mason wrapped up his introduction, then nodded to Carla. "Our program coordinator will take you through the specifics of what we do and how we do it." As Carla moved to the front of the room, Mason joined Bull and some of the original 8 at a table near the side door. Bull, his imposing frame now slightly stooped with arthritis, but no less commanding, nodded his approval. "Good turnout," he rumbled, keeping his voice low. "Seems that way." Mason agreed, scanning the audience. "Question is, how many will stick after they understand what they're signing up for?" "Half if we're lucky," said Preacher, the former schoolteacher whose analytical mind had helped structure their growing operation. "But half of 30 is still 15 new volunteers. We need every one of them with the Riverside expansion." The Riverside expansion represented their most ambitious project to date. The Brotherhood had purchased a foreclosed motel on the outskirts of Riverside County, which they were converting into transitional housing for families fleeing domestic violence. Unlike traditional shelters with their 30-day limits, the Riverside property would offer stays up to 6 months, giving survivors time to heal, find employment, and establish true independence. The project had drawn unexpected attention and support. What began as a motorcycle club's side mission had evolved into a respected nonprofit with community backing. Local businesses donated materials. Contractors offered discounted services. Even the county officials who once viewed the Brotherhood with suspicion now attended fundraisers and championed their cause. As Carla detailed the various roles volunteers could fill, Mason's mind drifted to the journey that had brought them here. They'd faced resistance initially. Some women were understandably hesitant to trust leather-clad bikers for protection. Some law enforcement officers outside Sheriff Bradley's jurisdiction viewed their efforts as vigilantism rather than community service. But results spoke louder than prejudice. Over 5 years, they'd helped more than 300 families escape dangerous situations. They had maintained a perfect safety record with not a single protected person harmed while under their watch. They'd established protocols with police departments across the region and formal partnerships with existing domestic violence organizations. The Iron Brotherhood's reputation had been transformed. The same men once viewed with suspicion when entering local businesses were now greeted with respect and gratitude. Children who had once hidden behind their parents when bikers approached now waved excitedly when Brotherhood members visited schools for safety presentations. Mason's reverie was interrupted when Hannah slipped into the empty chair beside him. She had her mother's eyes and determination, but there was something uniquely her own in her confident demeanor. "What do you think, Mr. Mason?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the prospective volunteers. "Will they work out?" Mason studied her thoughtfully. Hannah never called him just Mason, despite years of familiarity. There was always that respectful Mr. attached, not from fear or formality, but from a place of genuine respect that touched him more than he'd ever admit. "Some will," he replied honestly. "Takes a special kind of person to do this work." Hannah nodded sagely. "Like you guys." "Like your mom," Mason corrected. "We just provide the muscle. She built this program." Hannah smiled. "Mom says it's a partnership. She knows what survivors need, but you guys know how to keep them safe." Mason couldn't argue with that assessment. The success of their program stemmed from that very balance, the lived experience of survivors combined with the Brotherhood's ability to provide physical security. Neither would have been sufficient alone. Carla was now explaining the vetting process for volunteers, a necessarily thorough procedure involving background checks, references, and a probationary period. The Iron Brotherhood took no chances with those they accepted into their ranks, particularly for their protection program. Trust was earned, not freely given. Hannah leaned closer to Mason, her voice dropping. "I'm going to be like you when I grow up, helping people who can't help themselves." Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest at her words, part pride, part concern. "You've got time to figure that out, kid. Plenty of ways to help people that don't involve the risks we take." Hannah gave him a look that was startlingly adult in its assessment. "I already know, Mr. Mason. I decided the day you stopped Derek in the parking lot." Before Mason could respond, the side door opened and Sheriff Tom Bradley entered quietly, nodding to the bikers at the table. Now in his early 60s, Bradley had become a steadfast ally of the Brotherhood's efforts, helping navigate the legal complexities of their work and providing legitimacy when skeptics questioned their methods. Bradley took the empty seat on Mason's other side, keeping his voice low to avoid interrupting Carla's presentation. "Thought you should know," he murmured. "Derek Walsh comes up for parole next month." The name sliced through the room like a cold blade, though only those at the table heard it. 5 years had passed since Derek had been sentenced to 10 years for the attempted arson at Carla's apartment building. 10 years that had been reduced to 5 with good behavior and overcrowding. Mason's jaw tightened. Hannah, who had been too young to remember Derek's full name, didn't react to the information. But she noticed the sudden tension at the table. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing for you to worry about." Mason assured her, exchanging a look with Bradley that communicated they'd discuss this later. "Why don't you go help your mom with the presentation?" Hannah clearly wasn't convinced, but respectfully did as asked, making her way back to her mother's side. "Thought he had at least another 3 years. Bull muttered once Hannah was out of earshot. "So did we," Bradley replied grimly. "System's overcrowded. He's been a model prisoner, completed anger management, substance abuse treatment, the whole rehabilitation checklist." "You believe he's changed?" Mason asked, already knowing the answer. Bradley sighed heavily. "Men like Walsh don't change, they adapt. They learn what to say, how to appear. His psych evaluations are concerning if you read between the lines. He's obsessive, holds grudges." "You think he'll come back here?" Preacher asked. "His parole conditions will forbid contact with Carla and Hannah, and technically require him to remain in the county where he's incarcerated," Bradley explained. "But once he's out, monitoring is minimal. Overworked parole officers, understaffed departments." Mason processed this information with the methodical calm that characterized his approach to all threats. "When's the hearing?" "June 12th, 3 weeks from now." "Can we block it?" Bradley shook his head. "I've already spoken with the district attorney. Without new evidence or violations during his incarceration, they can't object to the hearing. Carla could make a victim statement, but—" "No," Mason cut in firmly. "She's worked too hard to put this behind her. Hannah's finally stopped having nightmares. We're not dragging them back into his orbit." "Agreed," Bull rumbled. "This is our problem to handle." The men fell silent as Carla concluded her presentation and began answering questions from the prospective volunteers. Her confidence as she addressed the crowd highlighted how far she'd come from the battered woman they'd rescued in Sally's parking lot. "We need to tell her," Preacher said finally. She has a right to know." After the meeting, Mason decided, let her finish this first. The next hour passed with the tension of unspoken concern hovering over the veterans' table. As the meeting concluded and prospective volunteers filed out with application packets, Mason approached Carla, who was gathering her materials. "Need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Bradley's here with some news." Something in his tone must have alerted her. Her hand stilled on the papers before her. "Hannah, honey," she said without looking up, "could you help Bull with the coffee cups, please?" Hannah glanced between them, clearly sensing something significant. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Carla assured her with practiced calm. "Just grown-up business stuff." Once Hannah was occupied across the room, Carla followed Mason to the table where Bradley waited. The sheriff explained the situation as gently as possible, but there was no softening the blow. Derek Walsh, the man who had nearly killed her and later attempted to burn her and her daughter alive, might soon walk free. Carla absorbed the news with remarkable composure, though Mason noted the whitening of her knuckles as she gripped the edge of the table. When Bradley finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "What are our options?" she asked, her voice steady. "You could attend the hearing, make a victim statement," Bradley offered. "It might influence the parole board. Or it might give him exactly what he wants," Mason countered. "Confirmation that you still think about him, that he still has power over your life." Carla nodded slowly. "And if he's released anyway, I've just reminded him we exist." She looked directly at Bradley. "Will he know where we are?" "Our current address isn't connected to my legal name." "Technically no," Bradley replied. "Your address is confidential through the Safe at Home program, but determined people find ways. So we prepare as if he's coming," Bull stated flatly, "whether he is or not." "Without terrifying Hannah," Carla added firmly. "She's worked too hard for her sense of security." Mason respected Carla's protective instinct but saw a flaw in her thinking. "Hannah's not a little girl anymore," he said gently. "She's old enough to understand precautions without being traumatized by them. Better she knows to be vigilant than be caught unaware." Carla closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the painful truth of his words. "You're right," she conceded, "but we present it as a general safety refresher, not specifically about him." "We can do that," Mason agreed. "Meanwhile, we'll implement full protection protocols, schedule reviews, resident security audit, transportation monitoring the works. I'll put unmarked cars near your home and office," Bradley added. "Not 24/7, we don't have the manpower, but regular drive-bys. And I'll make sure all my deputies have Walsh's photo and vehicle description once we know what he's driving." Carla nodded her understanding, then asked the question Mason had been dreading. "Do you think he'll come for us?" The men exchanged glances, weighing honesty against comfort. "Men like Derek," Mason said finally, "they feed on control. We took that from him very publicly. Some men can let that go, others can't live with the humiliation." He met her gaze directly. "I think we need to prepare as if he's carrying 5 years of resentment. If he proves us wrong, we've lost nothing but time." Carla absorbed this with a small nod. "Then we prepare. But we don't let him steal our lives again, even from a distance. The Riverside Project continues. The program expands. We keep helping others." Her resilience has always impressed Mason. This woman who had every right to retreat into fear instead chose to advance. It was why the Brotherhood had rallied around her cause, transforming their club in the process. "We should tell Hannah together," Carla decided. "Not about Derek specifically, but about being extra careful for a while." Mason agreed, and they called Hannah over. With remarkable maturity, the 12-year-old listened as they explained that they would be implementing some additional security measures as a precaution. She asked pointed, intelligent questions that reflected her years growing up in the Brotherhood's protective circle. "Is someone bad coming?" she asked, finally cutting to the heart of the matter. "We don't know, honey," Carla answered honestly, "but the Brotherhood has always kept us safe by being prepared right." Hannah nodded solemnly, then turned to Mason. "Will you teach me more self-defense, the serious kind, not just the basic stuff?" Mason glanced at Carla, who hesitated before giving a slight nod. "All right, kid," he agreed. "2 conditions. You take it seriously, and you never use it unless absolutely necessary." "I promise," Hannah said with such gravity that for a moment Mason saw the shadow of the terrified 7-year-old who had burst into Sally's diner. The contrast between that child and the composed young person before him was a testament to resilience he could scarcely comprehend. The next 3 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. The Iron Brotherhood implemented their highest level of protection protocols developed over years of safeguarding vulnerable families. They conducted a complete security audit of Carla and Hannah's home, installing additional cameras, reinforcing entry points, and establishing emergency response plans. Mason personally supervised Hannah's self-defense training, teaching her practical techniques focused on escape rather than confrontation. She proved an apt pupil, focused and determined. Sometimes too determined, pushing herself with an intensity that concerned him. "Slow down, kid," he cautioned one afternoon as she practiced breaking free from a wrist grab for the 20th time. "This isn't about perfection. It's about awareness and reaction." "I need to get it right," Hannah insisted, her young face set with determination. "If he comes back—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. Mason knelt to her eye level, his weathered face serious. Hannah, listen to me. If Derek Walsh or anyone else ever threatens you, you don't fight. You run. You hide. You call for help. That's why we have phones. That's why we have the brotherhood. But what if I can't run? Her voice was small but steady. What if he catches me like he caught Mom? The question pierced Mason with its clarity and terrible insight. Of course, this child who had witnessed her mother's brutalization would fear being similarly trapped. That's not going to happen, Mason assured her, his voice gentle but firm. We won't let it. But these techniques are your last resort, not your first defense. Understand? Hannah nodded reluctantly. I remember him, you know, she said quietly. Not his name or what he looked like exactly, but I remember how scared Mom was, how scared I was. I don't ever want to feel that way again. Mason felt a familiar protective surge coupled with deep respect for this young person's courage. Fear keeps us alert, he told her, but it doesn't have to control us. You proved that the day you ran into Sally's for help. Hannah seemed to draw strength from the reminder. I wasn't brave, I was terrified. Bravery isn't about not feeling fear, Mason corrected. It's about acting despite it. You were the bravest person in that diner that morning. As the parole hearing approached, tension mounted among the Brotherhood members, though they maintained normal operations. The Riverside renovation continued on schedule. New volunteers were vetted and trained. Families in crisis were still transported to safety. On the morning of June 12th, Mason Bull and Sheriff Bradley attended the parole hearing 3 counties away. Carla had decided not to attend, choosing instead to maintain her routine at the Brotherhood office surrounded by supportive colleagues. Hannah went to her summer art program as usual, with Doc discreetly stationed nearby. The hearing proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Derek Walsh presented as a model of rehabilitation, respectful, remorseful, reformed. He spoke eloquently about his substance abuse issues at the time of his crimes, his anger management progress, his newfound spiritual foundation. If Mason hadn't witnessed Walsh's calculating violence firsthand, he might have been convinced. Sheriff Bradley presented his professional concerns about the release, carefully documenting Walsh's escalating pattern of violence and fixation on his victim. Mason testified about the night of the attempted arson, highlighting the premeditation involved in bringing gasoline and a crowbar to Carla's apartment building. The parole board deliberated for 40 minutes before rendering their decision. Despite the objections, Derek Walsh was granted parole effective in 2 weeks. His conditions included no contact with Carla or Hannah Matthews' residence restrictions, keeping him at least 2 counties away. Regular check-ins with a parole officer, continued substance abuse testing, and anger management counseling. As they left the hearing, Mason felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. The conditions looked substantial on paper, but would be minimally enforced due to an overwhelmed system. Walsh's performance had been too perfect, too practiced. The man they'd encountered 5 years ago still lurked behind the rehabilitative facade. He's coming, Mason said simply as they walked to their vehicles. Bradley nodded grimly. I think so too. Question is, when and how. He'll wait, Bull predicted. Let everyone's guard down, make it look like he's following the rules. Then we don't let our guard down, Mason concluded. Not for a minute. The next morning, Mason convened an emergency meeting of all Brotherhood members involved in the protection program. In the clubhouse's main room, he laid out the situation without embellishment. Derek Walsh gets out in 13 days, he announced. Sheriff Bradley and I believe he'll eventually violate his parole conditions and come looking for Carla and Hannah. We don't know when. Could be immediately, could be months from now. What we do know is that we'll be ready. He outlined a comprehensive security plan involving rotating surveillance escort protocols and emergency response procedures. No detail was too small, from varying daily routes to establishing safe houses throughout the region. This isn't just about Carla and Hannah anymore, Mason emphasized. This is about everything we've built, the families who depend on us, the reputation we've earned. If Walsh gets through us to harm them, he doesn't just hurt them, he undermines everything the Defenders program stands for. The Brotherhood members nodded their understanding. What had begun as the protection of one family had evolved into a mission that defined them. Their commitment wasn't just to Carla and Hannah, but to the principle that the vulnerable deserve protection, that no one should face violence alone. As the meeting concluded, Preacher approached Mason with a concerned expression. We need to consider something, he said quietly. If Walsh is as fixated as we believe, he won't just be targeting Carla and Hannah, he'll target anyone close to them. Meaning us, Mason acknowledged. Especially you, Preacher specified. You're the one who stopped him, twice, publicly. You humiliated him. Mason absorbed this without visible reaction, though inwardly he recognized the truth in Preacher's words. I can handle myself. No one's questioning that, Preacher assured him. But if he can't get to them, he might try to get to them through you. We need to be prepared for that possibility. Mason nodded his agreement. Fair point. We'll implement full protection protocols for all primary members involved in the original case. The next 2 weeks passed with heightened vigilance, but no sign of trouble. Derek Walsh was released as scheduled and established residence in a halfway house 2 counties away as required by his parole. His parole officer reported that he had secured a job at a warehouse and was attending all required counseling sessions. On the surface, it appeared the Brotherhood's concerns might have been unwarranted, but Mason didn't believe in coincidences, and the reports that Walsh had inquired about motorcycle repair courses at the local community college struck him as significant. "He's planning something," Mason told Bull one evening as they shared a quiet drink at the clubhouse. "Learning about bikes, getting a job that builds physical strength, following every rule to avoid suspicion." "Agreed," Bull rumbled. "Question is whether we wait for him to make a move or take preventive action." "We can't touch him," Mason said firmly. "Not without cause. We operate within the law, always have." "The law doesn't always protect the people who need protecting," Bull countered. "No," Mason acknowledged. "That's why we exist, but if we cross that line, we're no better than the men we protect people from." Bull nodded, respecting Mason's position, even if he didn't entirely share it. "So we wait and watch." "We wait and watch," Mason confirmed, "and we make sure he knows he's being watched." The summer heat intensified as July turned to August, with no sign of Walsh violating his parole conditions. The Brotherhood maintained their vigilance, but began to wonder if perhaps rehabilitation had worked, or at least if the strict conditions had deterred any potential revenge plans. Meanwhile, the Riverside project neared completion. The renovated motel now featured 12 fully furnished apartments, each designed to house a family, transitioning from crisis to stability. The grand opening was scheduled for September 1st, with local officials, donors, and community members invited to celebrate the Iron Brotherhood's most ambitious achievement. Carla threw herself into organizing the event, determined not to let the shadow of Derek Walsh's release darken this milestone. Hannah designed artwork for each apartment, creating welcoming landscapes that conveyed hope and peace. The Brotherhood members handled security planning, ensuring the event would be both welcoming and safe. 2 days before the grand opening, Mason received a call from Sheriff Bradley. "Walsh missed his parole check-in yesterday," Bradley reported without preamble. "His halfway house says he left for work but never returned. His employer says he called in sick." Mason felt a cold certainty settle over him. "He's coming." "Looks that way," Bradley agreed. "I've alerted all departments in the region." His photo is being distributed, but Mason, he's had nearly 2 months to plan. He could be anywhere. "Not anywhere," Mason corrected. "He's coming here. The question is whether he's already arrived." Mason immediately activated their highest alert protocols. Brotherhood members converged on Carla and Hannah's residence, establishing a protective perimeter. Others secured the clubhouse and Riverside property. Carla and Hannah were moved to a predetermined safe location, a cabin owned by one of the members in the mountains with 4 Brotherhood members as security. The grand opening event was postponed indefinitely, much to Carla's dismay, but with her understanding of the necessity. All Brotherhood members were armed with Walsh's most recent photo and advised to travel in pairs. Sheriff Bradley doubled patrols near locations associated with the Brotherhood. 3 tense days passed with no sign of Walsh. No credit card usage, no cell phone activity, no vehicle sightings. It was as if he had vanished, which only heightened Mason's concern. A man who could disappear so completely had planned meticulously. On the 4th day, Mason visited the mountain cabin to check on Carla and Hannah. The isolated property sat on 10 wooded acres, accessible only by a winding dirt road. 2 Brotherhood members patrolled the perimeter, while 2 more remained inside with the Matthews family. Hannah greeted Mason with a fierce hug when he arrived. Despite the circumstances, she seemed remarkably composed, helping her mother prepare lunch and working on schoolwork sent by her teachers. "Any news?" Carla asked quietly when Hannah stepped outside with Hammer to feed the birds that frequented the cabin's feeders. Mason shook his head. "Nothing yet. Bradley has alerts out across 5 states. Parole office has issued a violation warrant." "But nothing," Carla concluded. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I hate this Mason. Not knowing, waiting. It feels like he's still controlling our lives." "It's temporary," Mason assured her. "Either he'll be caught or he'll show up," Carla finished. "And then what?" Mason met her gaze directly. "Then we'll handle it, once and for all." Carla studied him, concern evident in her expression. "Just be careful, all of you. I couldn't bear it if someone got hurt protecting us." "That's our choice," Mason reminded her. "Always has been." Their conversation was interrupted by Hannah's returns, her cheeks flushed from the mountain air. "Mr. Mason Hammer says you're staying overnight. Is that true?" Mason nodded. "Thought I'd give Preacher a break. That okay with you, kid?" Hannah's face brightened. "Of course, can we continue my training?" Mason glanced at Carla, who nodded her permission. "Just the defensive moves," she specified. "Nothing aggressive." For the remainder of the afternoon, Mason worked with Hannah on situational awareness and evasion techniques, impressed by her focus and retention. She had inherited her mother's determination, but tempered it with a strategic mind that reminded him somewhat uncomfortably of himself. As evening approached, Mason received a troubling call from Bull. One of their newer volunteers, a man who had joined just before Walsh's release, had missed his shift at the Riverside property and wasn't answering his phone. Initial checks revealed discrepancies in his background that had somehow slipped through their vetting process. "You think Walsh infiltrated us?" Mason asked, keeping his voice low as he stepped outside the cabin. "Can't rule it out," Bull replied. "The physical resemblance isn't strong, but hair color, eye color can be changed. We're pulling security footage now." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain evening. "If that's the case, he knows our protocols, possibly our safe house locations." "Already thought of that," Bull assured him. "We're sending additional security to all locations. Doc and Tank are 15 minutes from you now." Mason's instincts, honed through decades of assessing threats, suddenly flared. "They need to hurry," he said tersely. "Something's not right here." He scanned the surrounding forest, the deepening shadows between trees now seeming more ominous than peaceful. Nothing appeared immediately out of place, yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Hammer," he called to the Brotherhood member monitoring the front approach. "Seen anything unusual?" Hammer shook his head. "All quiet. Rivet's walking the perimeter now, and Sparky's on the back deck." Mason nodded, not entirely reassured. "Stay sharp. Doc and Tank are incoming for additional support. No one approaches without confirmation." Inside, he found Carla preparing dinner while Hannah set the table, the domestic scene incongruous with the tension he felt mounting. "Everything okay?" Carla asked, noting his expression. "Fine." Mason assured her, not wanting to raise alarm unnecessarily. "Just a small change in the rotation. Doc and Tank will be joining us soon." Dun. Carla's eyes narrowed slightly. After 5 years working closely with the Brotherhood, she could read between the lines. "Is there a specific reason for the additional security?" Before Mason could decide how much to share, a sharp crack echoed from outside, followed immediately by Hammer's voice over the radio clipped to Mason's belt. "Movement in the trees north side." Mason's training took over instantly. "Down," he commanded his voice, leaving no room for question. "Away from the windows. Now." Carla reacted immediately, pulling Hannah to the floor and moving toward the interior hallway. Mason drew his licensed firearm from his ankle holster and moved to secure the front door. "Hammer report," he called into the radio. Static answered him, then a burst of gunfire from outside. Mason's heart clenched, but his mind remained coldly tactical. One Brotherhood member down or disabled, unknown number of assailants. 2 more brothers outside who might or might not be compromised. "Sparky position," he called into the radio. "Back deck," came the immediate response. "Heard shots, moving to assist Hammer." "Negative," Mason ordered. "Secure the rear entrance. We have civilians inside." The term civilians was their code for protected persons, an instant signal that the priority was defense, not engagement. "Copy that," Sparky responded. "Rear secure." Mason turned to find Carla and Hannah huddled in the hallway away from exterior walls. Carla's face showed fear but also resolve. Hannah's eyes were wide but dry, her jaw set in determination. "Safe room," Mason directed, referring to the reinforced interior bathroom they had designated during their arrival briefing. "Now, lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me, and only if I use the passcode." What about you?" Hannah asked, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm going to make sure whatever's out there stays out there," Mason assured her with a confidence he fully felt. This was why the Brotherhood existed. This was what they had trained for. As Carla and Hannah retreated to the safe room, Mason contacted Bull on a secure channel. "We have contact at the mountain house. At least 1 man down. Unknown number of hostiles." "Doc and Tank are 10 minutes out," Bull replied. "Sheriff Bradley is mobilizing, but it's a 30-minute response time minimum. Hold tight." "Not planning on going anywhere," Mason responded grimly. A crash from the rear of the cabin sent Mason moving swiftly toward the kitchen. Through the window, he caught sight of Sparky engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a masked figure on the deck. Despite the mask, Mason recognized the fighting style immediately. The brutal efficiency, the focused rage, Derek Walsh. Mason moved to assist, but before he could reach the back door, a second attacker emerged from the tree line, raising what appeared to be a hunting rifle. Mason took aim through the window and fired twice. The figure dropped, but Mason couldn't tell if he'd hit his target or if the man had simply taken cover. On the deck, Sparky had momentarily gained the upper hand, driving Walsh against the railing, but Walsh fought with the desperate fury of a man with nothing to lose. He broke Sparky's hold and delivered a vicious strike to the biker's throat, dropping him instantly. Mason fired through the glass door, but Walsh rolled away with surprising agility, disappearing from view. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the preceding chaos. Mason knew Walsh hadn't retreated. He was repositioning, assessing, planning his next move. The radio crackled. "This is Rivet, south perimeter. I've got a man down here. Looks like he was ambushed. Can't raise Hammer." "We have at least 2 hostiles," Mason informed him. "One confirmed as Walsh. Sparky's down on the back deck. Set a perimeter and hold position. Do not approach the cabin alone." "Copy that," Rivet acknowledged. Mason calculated the situation rapidly. 3 Brotherhood members down or unaccounted for, 1 remaining on the perimeter. 10 minutes until reinforcements arrived. An unknown number of hostiles, but at least 2 confirmed. Walsh had clearly planned this meticulously, studying their protocols and finding the weak points. A voice called from outside, chillingly familiar despite the 5 years since Mason had last heard it. "Mason Cole, I know you're in there with them." Walsh's voice carried from somewhere near the side of the cabin. Mason didn't respond, unwilling to give away his position. 5 years I thought about this day," Walsh continued. 5 years I planned every detail. You thought you were so righteous taking what was mine." Mason moved silently through the cabin, tracking the voice as it shifted position. Walsh was circling, looking for an opening. "They were never yours," Mason called back, intentionally projecting his voice toward the front of the cabin while he moved toward the rear. "And you're making a big mistake right now. Our reinforcements are minutes away." Walsh laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You think I don't know your protocols? Your response times I've been watching for weeks, studying, learning. I had help you know. Not everyone loves the high and mighty Iron Brotherhood." The implication that Walsh had assistance from within their extended network was troubling, but Mason filed that concern away for later. Right now his priority was keeping Walsh occupied until backup arrived. "It's not too late to walk away," Mason offered, knowing the attempt was futile but needing to buy time. "You're already facing parole violation. Don't add more charges. Walk away." Walsh's voice rose in pitch indignation, breaking through his calculated calm. "After what you took from me, my woman, my reputation, my freedom, no Mason Cole. This ends tonight." A sudden crash of breaking glass came from the bedroom on the far side of the cabin. A diversion Mason realized instantly. Walsh was too smart to telegraph his true point of entry. Mason held position, listening intently. The faint creak of floorboards in the hallway confirmed his suspicion. Walsh had created a diversion on one side while entering from another. He was inside the cabin now, between Mason and the safe room where Carla and Hannah were hidden. Mason moved with the silence of a man who had spent decades honing his awareness of his surroundings. He knew every board that creaked, every shadow cast by the cabin's exterior lights. As he edged toward the hallway, he caught a glimpse of Walsh's silhouette moving with similar stealth toward the interior of the house. In Walsh's hand gleamed the unmistakable shape of a hunting knife, its blade catching the dim light from the kitchen. The man had come prepared for close-quarters combat, understanding that gunfire would draw attention and response. Mason assessed his options rapidly. He could call out, alert Walsh to his position, and potentially draw him away from the safe room. Or he could attempt to neutralize the threat, silently preventing Walsh from ever reaching Carla and Hannah. The decision was made for him when Walsh paused outside the bathroom door, testing the handle. Finding it locked, he smiled in the darkness, an expression of satisfaction visible even in profile. "I know you're in there, Carla," he called softly, his voice a grotesque parody of tenderness. "You and that brat of yours. Did you think you could hide from me forever after what you did, after how you humiliated me?" Inside the bathroom, silence. Carla had prepared Hannah well, Mason realized with grim approval. No response, no indication of their presence. Walsh's voice hardened. "Open the door, Carla. Now. Or I start hurting people until you do. I've already taken down 3 of your precious biker protectors. How many more need to suffer before you face me?" Mason had heard enough. He stepped into the hallway, gun raised. "That's enough, Walsh." Derek Walsh turned slowly, unsurprised by Mason's appearance. In the dim light, Mason could see that prison had changed the man physically. He was leaner, more muscular, his once florid face now gaunt and weathered, but the eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, devoid of empathy. "Mason Cole," Walsh said, as if greeting an old friend, "the knight in leather armor. I was wondering when you'd show yourself." "Step away from the door," Mason ordered, his voice steady. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Walsh smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I don't think so. Not this time. See, last time you caught me by surprise. This time I'm ready. Pshack. Defenders when bikers become heroes." And Part 3. Legacy of Brotherhood. The slight shift in Walsh's posture was all the warning Mason received. With surprising speed, Walsh hurled the hunting knife directly at Mason's chest. Decades of barroom brawls and street fights enabled Mason to twist away the blade, slicing through his shirt sleeve instead of embedding in his torso. In the split second of Mason's defensive movement, Walsh charged, tackling the older man with the full force of his prison-hardened body. The impact drove them both into the living room, Mason's gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as they crashed into furniture. Despite the 5-year age difference since their last encounter and the 20-year gap between them, Mason held his own. This wasn't his first life-or-death struggle, and the stakes had never been higher. Every Brotherhood training session, every street fight, every moment of his hard-lived life had prepared him for this moment. Walsh fought with the desperate fury of a man consumed by revenge. Mason fought with the controlled precision of a man defending something greater than himself. They were evenly matched in determination, if not in raw strength. The struggle carried them across the living room furniture, splintering beneath their combined weight. Mason managed to land a solid blow to Walsh's solar plexus, temporarily gaining the upper hand. But Walsh recovered quickly, driving his elbow into Mason's ribs with a crack that suggested at least one had fractured. Pain lanced through Mason's side, but he pushed it aside with the discipline of a man accustomed to fighting through injury. He caught Walsh's next strike and used the man's momentum to fling him into the stone fireplace. Walsh's head struck the masonry with a sickening thud, momentarily stunning him. Mason seized the opportunity to retrieve his weapon, which had skittered under the sofa during their struggle. As his fingers closed around the grip, Walsh tackled him from behind, driving him face first into the hardwood floor. The gun once again flew from Mason's grasp. "You're getting old, Mason," Walsh taunted, securing a chokehold around Mason's neck. "Not as quick as you used to be." Mason felt his vision beginning to darken as Walsh applied pressure to his carotid arteries. The younger man knew what he was doing, applying a blood choke designed to render an opponent unconscious in seconds. With his oxygen supply diminishing rapidly, Mason reached desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. His fingers brushed against a shard of glass from a shattered coffee table. Gripping it despite the way it sliced into his palm, Mason drove it backward with all his remaining strength. Walsh howled as the glass penetrated his thigh, his grip loosening just enough for Mason to break free. Both men staggered to their feet, bloody and battered, but far from finished. "You can't win this," Mason gasped, fighting to regulate his breathing. "Even if you kill me, you'll never get to them. The Brotherhood will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Walsh laughed, a manic edge to the sound. "You think I care about after? There is no after. There's only now, only making you all pay." The statement chilled Mason more than any physical threat. Walsh wasn't planning to escape. He was on a suicide mission, determined to exact revenge, without concern for his own survival. Such men were the most dangerous of all. As they circled each other in the destroyed living room, Mason heard the distant sound of motorcycle engines. Reinforcements were coming, but would they arrive in time? Walsh heard it too, his face contorted with rage and determination. "Too late!" he snarled, drawing a concealed pistol from his ankle holster. Mason lunged just as Walsh raised the weapon. They crashed together again, the gun discharging between them. Mason felt a burning sensation along his side, but no immediate debilitating pain. The bullet had grazed him rather than penetrating. With renewed desperation, knowing this might be his last chance to end the threat, Mason summoned every ounce of strength he possessed. He drove Walsh backward through the front window glass, shattering around them as they tumbled onto the porch. The cool night air hit them both, momentarily shocking after the heated intensity of their indoor battle. Mason maintained his grip on Walsh's gun hand, forcing it upward as they rolled across the wooden planks. Walsh fought with the frenzied energy of a cornered animal biting and clawing, but Mason had the high ground now, both literally and figuratively. With a final decisive movement, he slammed Walsh's gun hand against the porch railing. The weapon discharged one final time before falling from Walsh's grasp and clattering to the ground below. Headlights cut through the darkness as vehicles approached up the winding road. Doc and Tank had arrived with Sheriff Bradley's deputies, likely not far behind. "It's over, Walsh," Mason said, maintaining his position despite his injuries. "Backup's here." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Walsh's face. This wasn't how he had planned it. His carefully orchestrated revenge was unraveling. With a sudden desperate heave, Walsh threw Mason off and scrambled to his feet. But rather than fleeing into the surrounding forest, he turned back toward the cabin door, toward Carla and Hannah. "No!" Mason roared, launching himself at Walsh's legs in a tackle that would have made a professional footballer proud. They crashed together one final time, the momentum carrying them off the edge of the porch. The 6-foot drop seemed to happen in slow motion, their bodies tangled together as they fell. Mason felt rather than heard the impact, a dull thud followed by an unnatural stillness from Walsh. When he rolled free and looked at his opponent, he understood why. In their fall, Walsh had landed awkwardly, his neck at an impossible angle, eyes open but unseeing. Derek Walsh was dead. Mason verified the absence of a pulse with professional detachment, then sagged back against the cabin's foundation stones. The sound of running footsteps approached as Doc and Tank rushed from their bikes, weapons drawn. Mason, Doc called, spotting him in the shadows beneath the porch. "Status: 1 hostile down," Mason reported mechanically, his voice raw from Walsh's chokehold. "Permanently. At least 1 more unaccounted for. 3 brothers down, conditions unknown." Tank immediately began coordinating a sweep of the property, while Doc knelt beside Mason's medical kit already open. "You look like hell," Doc observed, beginning to assess Mason's injuries. "Feel worse," Mason admitted. "But I'm mobile. Check the others first, and get the all-clear signal to the safe room. Hannah and Carla are locked in the bathroom." Doc nodded, pressing a field dressing against the bullet graze on Mason's side. "Tank will handle it. You've done enough for one night. Let me do my job now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Bradley and his deputies arrived, securing the scene and beginning their investigation. Hammer was found unconscious but alive near the front approach, having been ambushed by Walsh's accomplice. Sparky had a crushed larynx but would recover with medical attention. The third Brotherhood member, Rive, had suffered a concussion but managed to apprehend Walsh's accomplice attempting to flee through the forest. The accomplice turned out to be the missing volunteer, confirming their suspicions of infiltration. Under questioning by Sheriff Bradley, he revealed that Walsh had approached him shortly after his release, offering substantial payment to help execute his revenge plan. He had applied to the Brotherhood's volunteer program specifically to gather intelligence on their protection protocols. Mason refused transport to the hospital until he personally verified Carla and Hannah's safety. When Tank delivered the all-clear code through the bathroom door, it opened to reveal Carla holding an improvised weapon made from a toilet tank lid, with Hannah positioned in the shower stall for maximum protection. The sight of Mason bloodied and battered but standing brought tears to both their eyes. "Is it over?" Hannah asked, her voice small but steady. Mason nodded, suddenly too exhausted for words. "For good this time," Carla pressed, needing absolute certainty. "For good," Mason confirmed. "He can't hurt you anymore, ever." Hannah rushed forward, then wrapping her arms around Mason's waist in a fierce hug that sent pain shooting through his cracked ribs. He didn't care. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the relief of keeping his promise. They were safe. The nightmare was truly over. As paramedics finally convinced Mason to sit on a stretcher for transport, Hannah refused to leave his side. "You kept your promise," she said simply. "Brotherhood always does," Mason replied, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Bull arrived as Mason was being loaded into the ambulance, his imposing figure silhouetted against the flashing emergency lights. He clasped Mason's hand briefly, the gesture conveying everything words couldn't: pride, relief, brotherhood. "Get yourself patched up," Bull ordered gruffly. "We've got a ribbon-cutting ceremony to reschedule." Mason managed a tired smile. Even now, with chaos around them, Bull was focused on their mission. On moving forward. It was why the Iron Brotherhood had survived for over 25 years while other clubs had fractured and dissolved. "Don't start without me," Mason requested as the ambulance doors closed. Then, 2 weeks later, Mason stood before a gathered crowd at the Riverside property, his ribs still tightly wrapped beneath his leather vest, but otherwise recovered from his confrontation with Walsh. Beside him, Carla and Hannah beamed with pride as local officials and community leaders praised the Iron Brotherhood's transformation of the abandoned motel into transitional housing. As Bull cut the ceremonial ribbon officially opening the facility, Mason felt a profound sense of completion. What had begun 5 years ago with a desperate child running into a diner had evolved into something none of them could have imagined. A mission, a purpose, a legacy. After the ceremony, as guests toured the renovated apartments, Hannah approached Mason with the serious expression he'd come to recognize as her important question face. "Mr. Mason," she began, "Mom says I can start learning to ride when I'm 16. Will you teach me?" Mason glanced at Carla, who nodded her permission with a smile. "Be my honor, kid," he agreed, "though by then you'll probably be teaching me a thing or two." Hannah grinned, then grew serious again. "I've decided what I want to do when I grow up," she announced. "For real this time." "Oh." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "I'm going to be a lawyer," Hannah declared. "The kind that helps people get away from bad situations and makes sure the bad guys stay locked up." Mason felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. This child who had endured trauma that would have broken many adults was determined to transform her experience into a force for good, just as the Brotherhood had done with their own rough pasts and hardscrabble skills. "The world could use more lawyers like that," he said simply. Hannah nodded, satisfied with his approval. "And on weekends," she added with a mischievous smile, "I'll ride with the Brotherhood." Mason laughed, a genuine sound of pure joy that drew glances from nearby guests unused to seeing the stoic sergeant-at-arms so unguarded. "I have no doubt about that, kid. No doubt at all." As the celebration continued around them, Mason took a moment to survey all they had accomplished. The renovated apartments that would shelter families in crisis. The expanded Brotherhood that now included community members of all backgrounds. The partnerships with law enforcement and social services that legitimized their work. But most of all, he took pride in Hannah and Carla, living embodiments of the Brotherhood's central belief that with proper protection and support, the vulnerable could not only survive but thrive. "Penny for your thoughts," Bull rumbled, joining Mason on the edge of the gathering. Mason gestured toward Hannah now, enthusiastically showing a group of officials the artwork she'd created for each apartment. "Just thinking that sometimes the most important journeys start with unexpected detours." Bull nodded his understanding. 5 years ago, we were just a bunch of old bikers eating breakfast. Now look at us." Defenders, Mason said the word, carrying weight and meaning beyond its simple definition. "Defenders," Bull agreed, clapping a hand on Mason's shoulder. 4 years passed. The Iron Brotherhood's Defenders program continued to grow, expanding to neighboring counties and eventually across state lines. What had begun as an emergency response to one family's crisis had evolved into a sophisticated network of safe houses, transportation services, and legal support for survivors of domestic violence. The Brotherhood itself had changed dramatically. While they still rode motorcycles and maintained their distinctive appearance, they had added new dimensions to their identity. Some members were former law enforcement officers who'd found purpose in the Brotherhood's mission. Others were social workers or counselors who recognized the need for physical security alongside emotional support. All shared the core values that had guided the Brotherhood's evolution: strength used in service of protection, presence without intrusion, support without dependency. Mason, now 64, found himself in an unexpected role: mentor to a new generation of protectors. He still rode, still served as sergeant-at-arms, but increasingly his value to the organization lay in his wisdom and institutional memory. He had become the living embodiment of the Brotherhood's transformation, a bridge between what they had been and what they were becoming. Hannah's 16th birthday arrived, and true to his word, Mason began teaching her to ride. She took to it naturally, with the same determination and focus she brought to everything. Her first solo ride on a small Sportster was a moment of quiet triumph for both of them, another milestone in her journey from terrified child to confident young woman. "You're a natural kid," Mason told her as she removed her helmet. After that first ride, her face flushed with exhilaration. "Had a good teacher," Hannah replied, her grin infectious. Carla watched from the sidelines, her expression a complex mixture of pride and lingering concern. She had rebuilt her life completely in the years since Walsh's final attack. Her work with the Brotherhood had led to a position coordinating victim services for the county sheriff's department, where she developed protocols based on the Brotherhood's successful approach. She had even begun dating again, cautiously, thoughtfully, a deputy sheriff who understood her history and respected her boundaries. The Riverside facility had proven so successful that the Brotherhood was already planning a second location. The challenges had been substantial zoning issues, funding shortfalls, occasional resistance from those who couldn't reconcile the image of leather-clad bikers with victim advocacy. But they had persevered, adapting their approach without compromising their core mission. One sunny afternoon, Mason sat in his office at the Brotherhood clubhouse reviewing security protocols for their upcoming charity ride. The space reflected the organization's evolution, motorcycle memorabilia sharing wall space with framed awards from victim advocacy groups and thank you letters from families they had helped. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Hannah stood in the doorway, now 16, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression unusually serious. "Got a minute?" she asked. Mason set aside his paperwork. "Always for you, kid. What's up?" Hannah entered, dropping her backpack and taking the seat across from him. "I've been doing research for my history project, about the Brotherhood." "Oh." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And what have you discovered?" "That it wasn't always like this," she said carefully. "Before Bull and you and the others, the Iron Brotherhood had a different reputation. More like the outlaw clubs." Mason nodded slowly. This wasn't unexpected. Hannah was smart, curious, and had access to public records. It was natural she would eventually uncover the Brotherhood's complicated history. "That's true," he acknowledged. "The Brotherhood went through some dark times in its early years, before Bull took over as president and established the code we follow now." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" There was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity. Mason considered the question carefully. "Didn't seem relevant to who we are now. The men who found you and your mom at Sally's Diner, the Brotherhood that's been protecting families all these years, that's who we really are. The rest is just history." Hannah nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "I think it makes what you've built even more impressive," she said thoughtfully. "That you took something with a negative reputation and transformed it into something that helps so many people." Mason smiled, touched by her perspective. "That's a generous way of looking at it." "It's the truth," Hannah insisted, "and it's why I'm even more certain about what I want to do. People can change, organizations can change, systems can change if they want to badly enough." Her conviction reminded Mason of Bull's words from decades earlier when he had first proposed the code that would guide the Brotherhood. "We're either part of the problem or part of the solution. There's no neutral ground." "You're going to make one hell of a lawyer," Mason told her, his pride evident. Hannah grinned. "And one hell of a biker on the weekends." The years continued to pass. Hannah graduated high school with honors and earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university where she double majored in pre-law and social work. During semester breaks, she returned home, dividing her time between her mother, her studies, and the Brotherhood that had become her extended family. Mason watched her evolution with pride and a touch of melancholy. The frightened child had grown into a formidable young woman with clear purpose and unshakable determination. Yet sometimes when she wasn't aware he was watching, he could still glimpse traces of the 7-year-old who had burst into Sally's Diner in the set of her jaw when she encountered injustice and the fierce protectiveness she showed toward other survivors. The Brotherhood itself continued to evolve. What had begun as a motorcycle club had developed into a complex organization with multiple facets: the original riding club, the Defenders program, and now a non-profit foundation that provided financial support for both. They had weathered challenges, both external and internal resistance from traditional victim advocacy groups who questioned their approach growing pains as they expanded beyond their original membership. The inevitable conflicts that arose as they navigated bureaucratic systems. Through it all, they had maintained their essential character, rough-edged men and women who recognized that their strength carried with it a responsibility to protect rather than intimidate. The leather vests remained, the motorcycles remained, but they had taken on new meaning, becoming symbols of safety rather than threat. Bull, now approaching 75, but still imposing despite his age, had stepped back from day-to-day leadership, though he remained the Brotherhood's president emeritus. His legacy was secure in the code he had established and the organization he had transformed. Younger members looked to him with the reverence due a founding father, while the original 8 shared with him the quiet satisfaction of seeing their shared vision realized beyond their expectations. On a warm spring evening 10 years after Derek Walsh's final attack, the Brotherhood gathered for a celebration. Hannah, now 22, had been accepted to law school at a prestigious university with a focus on family law and victim advocacy. The gathering was part send-off, part recognition of this milestone in her journey. Sally's Diner, still operating under the management of Sally's daughter, had closed to the public for the evening to host the event. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This is where it had all begun, where a desperate child had made the choice that would transform not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. Mason sat in the back booth, the same one where he and his brothers had been eating breakfast on that fateful morning, watching as Hannah moved through the crowd. She greeted each Brotherhood member by name, her ease with these rough men and women, a testament to the decade she had spent in their protective circle. Her confidence, her poise, her clear sense of purpose all spoke to how completely she had transformed trauma into strength. "She's something, isn't she?" Carla said, sliding into the booth across from Mason. At 42, she had grown into a formidable woman in her own right, respected for her work with survivors and her advocacy for systemic change. "That she is," Mason agreed. "You've done an amazing job with her." "We've done an amazing job," Carla corrected gently. "I couldn't have done it alone, not after what happened." Mason accepted her words with a slight nod. The relationship between Carla, Hannah, and the Brotherhood had long since transcended the traditional boundaries between protector and protected. They had become something more complex and meaningful partners in a shared mission family bound not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. The evening progressed with food stories, laughter. The original 8 Brotherhood members, now mostly in their 60s and 70s, shared tales of the early days carefully edited for their younger audience. Hannah spoke of her plans for law school and beyond her vision for integrating legal advocacy with the Brotherhood's protection model. As the gathering began to wind down, Hannah clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the young woman who had grown up in their collective care. "I want to thank all of you," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Not just for tonight, but for everything. For being there when Mom and I needed you most. For showing me what real strength looks like. For teaching me that family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside you in your darkest moments." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting each pair of eyes. 10 years ago, I ran into this diner because I was desperate and scared and didn't know where else to turn. I found more than protection that day. I found a purpose, a calling, a family. Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. Around the room, he saw similar reactions from his brothers, these tough men unashamed of the impact this young woman had on their lives. "As I head to law school," Hannah continued, "I'm taking with me everything you've taught me. About protection, about justice, about transformation. I promise to use those lessons to help others the way you helped me." She raised her glass. "To the Iron Brotherhood. To the defenders who changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of others. Thank you for showing me that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather and ride Harleys." The toast was met with raised glasses and gruff acknowledgments, these men unused to such open recognition of their impact. But Mason saw in their eyes what he felt in his own heart, profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led them from a simple act of protection to a transformed purpose. Later, as the gathering dispersed, Mason found himself alone with Hannah outside the diner. The night was clear, stars visible despite the town's lights, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring. "You ready for this next chapter, kid?" he asked. Hannah nodded, her expression determined. "More than ready. Law school's just the beginning. I have big plans for what comes after." "Oh." Mason raised an eyebrow. "The Brotherhood's model works," she said with the certainty of someone who had seen the results firsthand, "but it's still limited in scope. I want to take what you've built and expand it. Create a nationwide network of protection and advocacy. Change how the system responds to domestic violence." Mason smiled, unsurprised by her ambition. Hannah had never thought small even as a child. "If anyone can do it, it's you." Hannah was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "I wouldn't be who I am without what happened that day," she said finally. "Without you and the Brotherhood. It's strange to think that something so terrible led to so much good." "That's how it works sometimes," Mason replied. The worst moments can lead to the best changes if you're willing to learn from them, to grow through them rather than just survive them. Hannah nodded thoughtfully. I used to have nightmares about that day, about what would have happened if you hadn't been in the diner when I ran in. But we were, Mason reminded her gently, and you found the courage to ask for help. That's what matters. Yes, Hannah agreed. That's what I'm going to remember. Not the fear, but the moment I decided to run toward help instead of away from danger. The moment everything changed. As they stood together in the parking lot where it had all begun, Mason reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed not just Hannah's life, but his own. A desperate child. A split-second decision to help. A purpose discovered in that moment of choice. A legacy that would continue long after he was gone. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with unexpected detours. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism emerge from ordinary moments of decision. Sometimes the most profound transformations start with the simple choice to stop when someone needs help, to stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them, to use one's strength in service of those who have none. Tut. 15 years later, a dedication ceremony took place on the outskirts of the city. Hundreds gathered to witness the opening of the Hannah Matthews Center for Family Safety, a comprehensive campus offering emergency housing, legal services, counseling, vocational training, and childcare for families rebuilding their lives after violence. Hannah herself, now 37, stood at the podium, surveying the crowd with quiet confidence. Beside her sat her mother Carla, now in her 60s but still actively involved in shaping policy and programs. Alongside them, in places of honor, sat the surviving members of the original 8 Iron Brotherhood members who had answered Hannah's cry for help that fateful morning. Mason Cole, now 80. His once imposing frame diminished by age, but his presence still commanding respect, listened as Hannah addressed the gathering. Bull Preacher and Doc flanked him, all now in their 80s, all still proudly wearing their Brotherhood vests despite their advanced years. The other original members had passed on, but their legacy lived in the organization they had helped transform. 25 years ago, Hannah began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, I learned something that would shape the rest of my life. I learned that sometimes the scariest-looking people are the ones most willing to help. And sometimes a single moment of courage, theirs and mine, can change not just one life, but thousands. She gestured toward the campus behind her, a sprawling complex that represented the culmination of decades of work. This center stands as a testament to what can happen when we refuse to look away from others in need, when we choose to stop to act to defend. What began as 8 bikers responding to a child's plea for help has grown into a national movement that has changed tens of thousands of lives. Hannah paused, her gaze moving to Mason and the other original Brotherhood members. These men taught me that strength isn't measured by the ability to intimidate, but by the willingness to protect. They showed me that family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside you in your darkest moments. Tears glistened in Mason's eyes as he listened, unashamed of the emotion that would once have been carefully concealed. Age had granted him the freedom to acknowledge feelings that younger Mason might have considered weakness. Pride, joy, a profound sense of purpose fulfilled. The Hannah Matthews Center, she continued, will carry forward the mission that began in a diner parking lot 25 years ago. It will provide immediate safety for those in crisis. It will offer paths to independence for those rebuilding their lives. Most importantly, it will embody the principle that has guided the Defenders program from the beginning, that with proper protection and support, the most vulnerable among us can not only survive, but thrive. As Hannah spoke, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The original confrontation with Derek Walsh that had saved Carla and Hannah. The expansion of the Brotherhood's mission to protect other families in crisis. The second confrontation with Walsh that had ended his threat permanently. The transformation of the Iron Brotherhood from a motorcycle club to the backbone of a movement. Through it all, Mason had watched Hannah grow from a frightened child to a determined teenager to a powerful advocate who had leveraged her personal experience into systemic change. Her law degree, earned while still actively participating in Brotherhood activities, had added legal expertise to the organization's practical knowledge. Her ability to move between worlds, academia, law enforcement, nonprofit administration, biker culture, had created bridges that might otherwise never have existed. The Hannah Matthews Center represented the culmination of that journey. While still partnering with the Brotherhood for security and transportation, it operated as an independent entity, bringing together various aspects of survivor support under one roof. The model had proven so effective that similar centers were already under development in 5 other states, with Hannah's organization providing guidance and support. Today we dedicate this center not just to providing services, Hannah was saying, but to changing the narrative about what's possible, to demonstrating that cycles of violence can be broken, that victims can become survivors and survivors can become leaders, that communities can come together across differences to protect their most vulnerable members. She gestured toward a wall where the photographs chronicled the evolution of the Defenders program. Prominently displayed was the image of Hannah at 7, standing beside Mason outside Sally's diner the day after the rescue, her small hand trustingly enclosed in his. Beside it hung a photo of Hannah at 17 receiving her honorary Brotherhood vest. Next came Hannah at 25 graduating law school with Brotherhood members cheering in the audience. The progression told a story of mutual transformation of lives intertwined by purpose. "None of this would have been possible without the Iron Brotherhood," Hannah acknowledged. "These men who many might have crossed the street to avoid became the foundation of a movement that has spread across the nation. They taught me and all of us that heroes come in unexpected packages, that courage isn't about fearlessness but about acting despite fear, that true strength lies in protection, not domination." At this, Bull nodded his weathered head in solemn agreement. Though advancing age had finally forced him to relinquish his role as a Brotherhood president, his influence on the organization's values remained indelible. Hannah had married 3 years earlier a prosecutor she had met during her first major case. He sat in the front row now, alongside their infant daughter, Sophia Sally, named for Sally's diner where it had all begun. Mason had been honored to walk Hannah down the aisle at her wedding, a role that had felt like the natural culmination of their journey together. "As we cut the ribbon on the center," Hannah continued, "I want to recognize the journey that brought us here. It began with my mother's courage, and fleeing abuse continued with my desperate run into that diner and found its purpose in the Brotherhood's unwavering response. From that collision of circumstances came a mission that has grown beyond anything we could have imagined." Carla reached over to squeeze Mason's hand, the gesture conveying decades of shared purpose and mutual respect. From reluctant protectee, she had become a powerful ally and eventually a leader in her own right, shaping the programs that had helped thousands of families like her own. "I ask you to join me now," Hannah said, moving toward the ceremonial ribbon, in opening the next chapter of this journey. The Hannah Matthews Center represents not an ending, but a beginning, a continuation of the promise made in a diner parking lot 25 years ago that no one facing violence should have to face it alone. As local officials and community leaders joined Hannah at the ribbon, Mason found himself transported back to that morning at Sally's. The terrified child, the desperate mother, the simplicity of the choice that had confronted him and his brothers, the absolute clarity of purpose that had guided them since. Hannah beckoned to Mason and the other original Brotherhood members. "You should be part of this," she insisted. "It all began with you." Slowly, with the deliberate movements of men who had lived hard lives and now felt every mile in their aging bodies, Mason and his brothers rose. They joined Hannah at the ribbon, these unlikely heroes who had transformed not just their own lives but the lives of countless others through their willingness to stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. As the ribbon was cut and applause erupted from the crowd, Mason felt a sense of completion that transcended any achievement of his younger years. The Iron Brotherhood had begun as a refuge for men seeking the freedom of the open road and the brotherhood of shared experience. It had evolved into something far greater, a force for protection, for justice, for transformation. The ceremony concluded and guests began touring the new facility. Mason found himself approached by a young woman in her early 20s, her expression hesitant but determined. "Mr. Cole," she said, "my name is Jessica. When I was 9, your organization helped my mom and me get away from my father. You probably don't remember, it was during the big expansion, and there were so many families, but I never forgot. I just graduated with my master's in social work, and I'll be working here at the center as a trauma counselor." Mason studied her face, searching for the child she had been and the woman she had become. "I remember," he said, though in truth the faces sometimes blurred together over the years. What remained clear was the mission. "How's your mother doing?" Jessica smiled. "She's great. Remarried to a kind man, got her nursing degree. She's actually part of the medical response team that will be working with the center." "That's good to hear," Mason said, genuinely pleased. "That's what it's all about, building new lives." "I wanted to thank you," Jessica continued, "not just for what you did for us, but for creating a model that showed what's possible. I've seen it from both sides now, as someone who needed help and as someone trained to provide it. The blueprint you and Ms. Matthews created, it works." Mason nodded, acknowledging her words while deflecting personal credit. "It works because of people like you who've lived through it and come back to help others. That's the real power of what we've built. It's self-sustaining now." As Mason moved through the center, he observed the culmination of 25 years of evolution, the emergency housing units designed with both security and dignity in mind, the legal clinic where attorneys and law students would help survivors navigate the complexities of restraining orders, custody battles, housing discrimination, the counseling center where trauma-informed therapists would help families rebuild their emotional lives, the vocational training facility where survivors would gain skills for financial independence, the child care center where children affected by violence would receive specialized support while their parents accessed services. All of it growing from a moment in a diner parking lot when 8 bikers had chosen to stand between a woman and her abuser. Hannah found him in the garden at the center of the campus, a peaceful space designed for reflection and healing. She joined him on the bench, the two of them sitting in companionable silence for several minutes. "Thank you," she said finally. "Thanks for everything." Mason shook his head slightly. "You've done all this," he said, gesturing toward the center. "We just gave you a chance." "No," Hannah disagreed gently. "You gave me more than that. You showed me what was possible. You let me see that strength could protect instead of harm. You taught me that the worst moments don't have to define us, they can transform us." Mason couldn't argue with her perspective. It aligned too closely with what he himself had experienced through his involvement with Hannah and Carla, with the Defenders program, with the evolution of the Brotherhood. "I've been thinking about legacy," Hannah continued, "about what we leave behind. The Brotherhood will continue after you and Bull and the original 8 are gone. The Defenders program will continue. This center will continue, but the most important legacy isn't in buildings or programs." "No," Mason prompted when she paused. "It's in moments of choice," Hannah said. "In that split second when someone decides to help rather than look away, when someone uses their strength to protect rather than harm, when someone stands between the vulnerable and those who would hurt them. That's the true legacy. Not what we build, but how we choose." As the sun began to set on the day of dedication, casting long shadows across the center's grounds, Mason reflected that Hannah had articulated perfectly what he had come to understand over the decades since she had burst into Sally's diner. The essence of what they had built wasn't in the structures or systems, though these were important. It was in the fundamental choice to protect rather than the harm, to stand up rather than look away, to use one's strength in service of those who needed it most. That choice made anew each day by each member of the expanding network was the true legacy of the Iron Brotherhood. That choice would endure long after the original 8 had taken their final rides, continuing to transform lives just as it had transformed their own. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with unexpected detours. Sometimes the most meaningful purposes emerge from unplanned encounters. Sometimes the greatest heroes are simply those who stop when someone needs help, who answer when someone asks for protection, who remain until safety is assured. And sometimes in choosing to be heroes for others, they find the redemption, purpose, and meaning they never knew they were seeking.